am your host, Miss Marple. Welcome to my channel, Sherlock Midnight Echo. Remember,
the annual winter solstice pageant at Winterbrook Manor was, by all accounts, supposed to be a triumph of civic sentiment over the bitter Hampshire frost. Sir Reginald Vance had spared no expense, transforming his manicured gardens into a dazzling, if somewhat ostentatious, winter wonderland. Snow lay heavy upon the yew hedges, and crisp, star-filled air carried the cheerful din of the local brass band across the lawn. Villagers huddled near braziers, clutching mugs of spiced cider, their hot breath blooming into transient white clouds. Among them sat Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a comfortable fleecy shawl, her knitting needles clicking with a soft, rhythmic cadence that seemed almost entirely detached from the icy weather. To the casual observer, she was merely a frail, elderly spinster soaking in the festivities. In truth, Miss Marple was observing human nature, a subject in which she possessed an almost frightening expertise. "Human nature, my dear," she had once remarked to her nephew Raymond, "is remarkably the same in a quiet village as it is anywhere else. Only in a village, one sees it under a microscope." At present, her microscope was focused on the head of the garden path, where the estate's famous artificial waterfall cascaded down a wall of flint and stone, or rather, where it usually cascaded. Sir Reginald, a man obsessed with theatrical flair, had commissioned an elaborate pump system to keep the water flowing despite the freezing temperatures, framing the grotto in dramatic blue floodlights. "It is a bit much, isn't it, Miss Marple?" whispered Clara Higgins, the vicar's wife, adjusting her woolen bonnet. "Sir Reginald does love a grand display, though I hear the repairs to the manor roof had to be postponed to pay for those dreadful floodlights." "Pride, Clara dear, so often demands a visually impressive stage," Miss Marple replied mildly, dropping a stitch, then deftly picking it up. "It reminds me so much of old Mr. Harbottle, who spent his entire life savings on a marble headstone, leaving his daughters without a penny for coal. A great desire to be remembered, I suppose." "Well, he certainly has the village talking," Clara murmured, her eyes darting toward Sir Reginald. The baronet, a tall, florid man with a booming voice and a moustache that seemed perpetually bristling with indignation, was currently arguing in hushed, furious tones behind the ice sculpture display. His companion was his younger brother, Julian Vance, a pale, sleek man who had recently returned from abroad under a cloud of unspoken financial ruin. Nearby stood Lady Eleanor, Sir Reginald's visibly exhausted wife, her pale eyes fixed staring blankly into her champagne flute, while young Arthur Pendleton, the local land surveyor, watched her with an intensity that went far beyond professional acquaintance. "A most interesting gathering," Miss Marple murmured to herself. The air was thick, not merely with frost, but with those tightly held, domestic resentments that so often fester behind heavy velvet curtains. Suddenly, a strange silence fell over the band, cutting short a spirited rendition of Asterisk, Good King Wenceslas Asterisk. The grand finale of the evening was meant to be the ceremonial lighting of the frozen grotto, culminating in Sir Reginald turning the heavy iron valve to double the waterfall's flow for the midnight countdown. Sir Reginald, breaking away from his brother with a sharp flick of his gloves, stepped up to the stone platform beside the roaring, illuminated grotto. "Friends, neighbors," Sir Reginald's voice echoed across the frozen lawn. "Welcome to Winterbrook." A modest cheer went up. Sir Reginald grasped the large wheel that controlled the main sluice gate embedded in the rocky facade above. With a grunt of exertion, he turned it. A heavy, mechanical thud echoed behind the stone wall. The rush of water altered, surging forward with a sudden violent roar. But instead of a magnificent curtain of crystal water, the floodlit torrent churned, buckled, and abruptly jammed against a massive obstruction wedged tight inside the upper grotto. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The sharp blue lights illuminated the top of the waterfall, where the gushing water cleared away a layer of loose snow and ice. Entangled within the iron sluice grating, suspended in a horrific, frozen frame behind the veil of ice, was a human body. Lady Eleanor dropped her glass. It shattered on the frozen flagstones with a crystalline ring. Screams erupted from the front row as the crowd recoiled in horror. Miss Marple did not scream. She merely lowered her knitting into her lap, her gentle blue eyes narrowing as she peered through the blue mist. She noted the expensive tweed coat, the distinctive silver-headed cane jammed uselessly against the rocks, and the unmistakable posture of a life cut suddenly, violently short. It was Gregory Thorne, the town's most prominent solicitor, a man who held the private deeds, mortgages, and secrets of almost everyone present on the lawn. As panic seized the village of Winterbrook, Miss Marple sat quietly in the frosty night air, her eyes moving thoughtfully from the corpse in the ice to the stunned, pale faces of the living. Section 2. Whispers in the snow. By 9 o'clock the following morning, the brilliant winter sun had done little to melt the icy pall hanging over Winterbrook. News of Gregory Thorne's demise had swept through the village faster than the bitter northerly wind, leaving a trail of muted panic and frantic conjecture in its wake. The village parlor at the Duck and Whistle was brimming with patronized warmth, roaring coal fires, and an unprecedented gathering of local busybodies. Inspector Slack of the county constabulary had already arrived, barking orders at Constable Wiggins and cordoning off the manor grounds with a officiousness that served only to inflame the town's appetite for scandal. Miss Marple sat near the leaded bay window, her fingers working rhythmically on a pale lilac cardigan. Across the small polished table sat Mrs. Higgins, whose tea was growing rapidly cold as she leaned forward, her voice dropped to a conspiratorial murmur. "They say his skull was fractured before he ever hit the water, Jane," Clara whispered, her eyes wide behind her spectacles. "A brutal mugging, no doubt. Someone from the high road, passing through to take his pocket watch. A tragic, random act of violence." Miss Marple clicked her knitting needles together, thoughtful. "A tramp, Clara dear? On a night when the manor grounds were patrolled by 3 groundsmen and lit up like a fairground. I remember young Tommy Cleaver, the boy who stole old Mrs. Gable's goose, remarking how impossible it was to slip past the lower gate without being seen by the gatekeeper. And Gregory Thorne was not a man to wander into dark grottos with strangers." "Well, then it must have been a robbery gone wrong," insisted Mr. Bantry, who had just stepped in from the cold, stamping his boots vigorously on the mat. "Thorne carried a great deal of cash, you know, always boasted about it. A man like that makes enemies among the rougher crowd." "Mr. Thorne was certainly a man of distinct financial habits," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "He reminded me very much of Mr. Henderson, the estate agent back in St. Mary Mead. He had that same energetic, slightly overbearing manner, always so very interested in everyone else's affairs. A most useful trait for a solicitor, of course, but it does leave one wondering whose affairs he was interested in yesterday evening." She looked out the leaded window just as Julian Vance strolled past on the cobblestones, his shoulders hunched against the chill, a cigarette burning down near his gloved fingers. He looked nervously over his shoulder before slipping into the back entrance of the bank. "Look at him," whispered Clara, following Jane's gaze. "Returned from London only 3 weeks ago, claiming to have made a fortune in rubber stocks, yet he hasn't paid his tab at the butcher's. My Arthur says Julian was seen arguing violently with Gregory Thorne in the village square just 2 days ago. Something about a deed of mortgage. And Sir Reginald," added Mr. Bantry, dropping into an armchair beside them. "He looked positively ghost-white when the body was pulled out. Everyone knows Sir Reginald borrowed heavily from Thorne to finance those ridiculous drainage works on the East Meadow. If Thorne was pressing for repayment, Sir Reginald would have been in a very tight spot indeed." Miss Marple listened attentively, taking in every fragment of gossip, every half-truth, and every self-serving theory. To the average investigator, this flood of local rumors was mere distraction. To Miss Marple, however, gossip was the raw material of truth. People revealed their own fears and prejudices in what they chose to believe about others. "It is extraordinary," Miss Marple remarked softly, "how quickly everyone leaps to the conclusion that a man was killed by his debtors or by a shadowy stranger. Yet when poor Miss Emily's pearl brooch vanished during the church bazaar, everyone blamed the plumber's assistant, when in fact it had merely caught on the fringe of her own shawl." "What are you driving at, Jane?" asked Clara, puzzled. "Only that we so often look for grand, dramatic motives, when human nature is usually driven by much smaller, meaner impulses," Miss Marple said gently. "Fear of exposure, for instance, or a sudden desperate need to keep a quiet secret quiet. Her attention shifted to the corner of the room, where Lady Eleanor Vance sat alone at a small mahogany table. She was dressed in deep mourning grey, staring blankly into her teacup, her posture stiff and fragile as blown glass. A few feet away, young Arthur Pendleton stood by the mantelpiece, pretending to read a local newspaper, though his eyes constantly darted toward the grieving woman with an expression of agonized solicitude. Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in Lady Eleanor's hand as she raised her cup, and the way Arthur's knuckles turned white against the edge of the newspaper whenever Inspector Slack's name was mentioned. "A very sad affair," Miss Marple murmured, rolling up her ball of wool. Gregory Thorne held the keys to many doors in Winterbrook. When a key is suddenly broken, one must ask which door was about to be opened or closed forever. "Well, Inspector Slack will have it sorted out by nightfall," declared Mr. Bantry with cheerful confidence. "He's already questioning the night watchman and checking the local alibis. A straightforward matter of following the money, he says." Miss Marple smiled gently, her blue eyes fading into that innocent, slightly vague expression that so effectively disarmed those around her. "Yes, indeed. Inspector Slack is always so very thorough with the obvious things. It is such a comfort." She stood up, carefully placing her knitting into her embroidered work bag. She had decided to pay a gentle, neighborly call on the vicarage, which happened to overlook the rear path leading toward the manor's frozen grotto. There were certain small, unremarkable details about the physical layout of the grounds that she wished to fix firmly in her mind. Details that had nothing to do with stolen watches or signed mortgages, but everything to do with the precise time it took for a vessel of water to freeze solid on a December night. Section 3. The listening post, ***. The vicarage drawing room offered an ideal vista over the south lawn of Winterbrook Manor, its high-arched windows framing the distant frost-draped silhouette of the iron grotto. Miss Marple sat in the plush armchair nearest the hearth, her fleece shawl tucked comfortably around her shoulders, sipping a second cup of Earl Grey. Beside her, Mrs. Higgins busied herself with a tray of scones, still twittering nervously about the village tragedy. Inspector Slack had spent the last 2 hours marching around the manor grounds, his boots crunching loudly on the frozen turf as he questioned groundsmen, measured footprints, and made voluminous notes in a small black leather book. To Slack, the world was a straightforward grid of motives and physical evidence. To Miss Marple, it was a complex tapestry of human frailty, where the smallest tear often revealed the whole hidden pattern. "He is certainly very energetic," Miss Marple remarked, watching the inspector through the window as he gestured wildly at the grotto's iron valve. "Reminds me so much of young Inspector Neal back in St. Mary Mead, always running about with tape measures and magnifying glasses, utterly convinced that a muddy boot print was the absolute key to everything. He quite overlooked the fact that old Mr. Clitheroe always wore his garden garnishes when visiting people he disliked. Slack seems convinced it was a premeditated ambush," Mrs. Higgins said, dropping 2 lumps of sugar into her own cup. "He told the vicar this morning that Gregory Thorne was lured to the grotto shortly before 9 o'clock. He believes someone hit him from behind with a heavy instrument, dragged him up the stone steps, and jammed him behind the sluice gate to prevent the water from flowing. A very heavy task for a winter's evening," Miss Marple observed softly. "And so remarkably noisy, one would think. The grotto is cold and exposed, but it is not entirely isolated. The brass band was playing nearby, and the servants were constantly passing to and fro with trays of hot punch." She paused, her bright blue eyes fixed on a quiet figure strolling down the gravel path below the vicarage wall. It was Arthur Pendleton, the land surveyor. He moved with a hesitant, jerky gait, his head down, clutching a leather map cylinder tightly beneath his arm. "Young Mr. Pendleton looks quite pale today," Miss Marple noted, setting her teacup down with a soft chink. "He was at the manor quite early last evening, was he not?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Higgins replied, leaning closer. "He arrived before 7 to check the structural safety of the temporary lighting rigs. Sir Reginald is always so demanding with contractors. But between you and me, Jane, Arthur hasn't been himself for months. Ever since Gregory Thorne began auditing the parish land records." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their steady, soothing rhythm. Click, clack, Click-clack. Land records can be extraordinarily troublesome. Old Colonel Bantry once discovered that his grandfather had inadvertently built a potting shed entirely on parish property. Such a fuss it caused, though it turned out to be a mere clerical error made in 1884. "I fear this is rather more serious," whispered Mrs. Higgins. "Arthur's late father was the estate manager before him, you know. If there were discrepancies in the boundary maps, merely small ones, Thorne would have found them. Thorne was ruthless about such things. He threatened to expose poor Mrs. Arbuthnot over a minor boundary dispute last autumn." Miss Marple nodded gently, absorbing the detail. A surveyor's reputation was his entire livelihood. A whisper of falsified maps or covered-up land disputes could destroy a young man entirely. Yet, as she watched Pendleton disappear around the yew hedge, she noted the specific way he held his left coat pocket bulging heavy against his hip, not with a map cylinder, but with something compact, square, and rigid. Before she could dwell on the thought, the drawing-room door opened, and Inspector Slack himself strode into the room, unbuttoning his heavy wool overcoat with an air of brisk, triumphant efficiency. "Ah, Mrs. Higgins." "Miss Marple," Slack acknowledged with a curt nod, clearly regarding the two elderly ladies as mere background scenery. "Just dropped in to use the vicar's telephone. We're making swift progress, I'm pleased to say. The net is closing in." "Oh, Inspector," Mrs. Higgins gasped. "Have you found the weapon?" "Better than that," Slack said with a confident smirk. "We've found the motive and the prime suspect, Julian Vance." Miss Marple looked up, her expression a picture of mild, innocent curiosity. "Dear Mr. Julian? Such a polite young man, though always so very careless with his scarves." "Careless with more than scarves, Miss Marple," Slack said pompously, enjoying his audience. "We've just searched Thorne's office at the manor. We found a signed promissory note from Julian Vance for £5,000, due midnight yesterday. Thorne was going to ruin him today, strip him of his inheritance, and expose his gambling debts to Sir Reginald. Julian was seen near the grotto at 8:45, looking panicked. Case is as good as solved." £5,000 is a great deal of money," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "And Mr. Julian certainly has an impulsive nature. It reminds me of young Peter Finch, who broke into the bakery because he couldn't pay his tailor's bill. But tell me, Inspector, a small detail puzzles me, though I am sure you have already accounted for it." Slack crossed his arms, mildly patronizing. "And what detail would that be?" "The ice," Miss Marple said gently. "Sir Reginald turned the iron valve at 11 o'clock. If Mr. Thorne was placed behind the sluice gate at 9 o'clock, in that bitter frost, why was his woolen coat soaked through with unfrozen water beneath the outer crust of ice? Surely, if he had laid dead in a frozen grotto for 2 hours before the valve was turned, his clothing would have been bone dry under the snowfall, rather than drenched from within." Inspector Slack blinked, his triumphant smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He cleared his throat loudly, shifting his weight. "A minor anomaly, Miss Marple. The heat from the floodlights, no doubt. We have the suspect and the motive. Science and logic will clear up the minor details." With a stiff bow, Slack marched out toward the vicar's study. Miss Marple watched him go, a soft, wistful sigh escaping her lips. "Dear me," she murmured to her knitting. "It is so dangerous to fit the facts to a theory, rather than the theory to the facts. The water had to come from somewhere before the valve was ever opened." Section 4. The web tightens, By early afternoon, Inspector Slack's triumphant declarations had hardened into official action. Julian Vance was formally taken into custody, escorted down the cobblestone high street by 2 stoic constables. A small crowd of villagers gathered near the Buttercross to watch, their whispers rising like steam in the sharp winter air. Julian walked with his chin thrust forward in defensive bravado, though his pale face and bloodshot eyes betrayed a terrified, desperate panic. Inside the cozy parlor of the vicarage, Miss Marple sat quietly by the small desk, carefully recording a few observations in her neat, spidery hand. Outside, the sky was darkening again, heavy with the promise of more snow. She picked up her fleece shawl, wrapped it securely around her shoulders, and decided it was time to take a gentle, unassuming stroll toward the manor grounds. As she crossed the terrace toward the Winter Gardens, she found Sir Reginald Vance pacing back and forth along the frost-covered gravel, an unlit cigar clenched tightly between his teeth. His usual booming confidence was entirely gone, replaced by a restless, jumpy agitation. "Miss Marple," Sir Reginald barked, stopping abruptly as she approached. "A dreadful business, utterly ghastly. Poor Gregory, dying right on my property, and now this absurdity with Julian. I tell you, the police are making a monumental mistake." "It must be a very painful time for you, Sir Reginald," Miss Marple said softly, her blue eyes filled with sympathetic warmth. "To lose a trusted business associate, and then to have your own brother suspected, it is a heavy cross to bear. Though I suppose Inspector Slack feels the financial arrangements between Mr. Julian and Mr. Thorne offer a very simple explanation." "Simple? Simple-minded, more like," Sir Reginald snapped, kicking a stray stone into the rhododendron bushes. "Julian is a fool, a reckless gambler, and a terrible disappointment to the family name, I grant you that. He steals from my late father's estate and runs up debts in every casino from Paris to Monte Carlo. But murder, Julian hasn't the stomach for violence. He faints at the sight of a scraped knee. Financial strain can make people act so very out of character," Miss Marple remarked gently, pulling her gloves tighter. "I remember young Martin Gale back in St. Mary Mead. Such a quiet, polite boy who sang in the choir, yet when he found himself hopelessly in debt to the local coal merchant, he did the most extraordinary thing. He forged his uncle's signature on a draft for £50. We were all utterly astonished." Sir Reginald winced, turning his face away toward the frozen lake. "Yes, well, Julian was desperate. He came to me yesterday afternoon begging for a loan to clear his debt with Thorne. I refused him point blank. I told him it was high time he faced the consequences of his foolishness. If I had known, if I had only given him the money." "You must not blame yourself, Sir Reginald," Miss Marple said, her voice dripping with gentle comfort. "We can only act according to our principles. But tell me, was Mr. Thorne expecting to receive that money from another source if your brother could not pay?" Sir Reginald paused, his thick eyebrows knitting together. "Thorne was a businessman, Miss Marple. He didn't care where the money came from, so long as he collected his interest. He told me yesterday morning that he had other irons in the fire that would yield a substantial return before midnight. I assumed he meant another of his speculative land investments." "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured, making a mental note of the phrase. At that moment, Lady Eleanor emerged from the conservatory doors, clutching a basket of dried lavender. She paused when she saw her husband, her expression hardening into a cold, impenetrable mask. The distance between the couple was palpable, a wide gulf of unspoken resentment that even the bitter frost could not deepen. "Reginald," Lady Eleanor called out, her voice flat and even. "The police are in the study again. They wish to see the ledger books regarding the drainage project." Sir Reginald's face flushed a dark, angry red. "More nonsense. Don't they have enough with Julian's promissory note? I'll deal with Slack myself." He turned on his heel and strode hastily back toward the manor, his heavy boots crunching loudly on the frozen earth. Miss Marple remained on the path, exchanging a polite, gentle smile with Lady Eleanor. "A most trying day for you, Lady Eleanor. I do hope you are taking care of your health in this bitter cold." "I am quite well, thank you, Miss Marple," Lady Eleanor replied, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts at composure. "It is just the horror of it all. To think that Gregory was killed right beside the grotto while we were all laughing and listening to music. It is the terrible suddenness of these things that strikes one so forcibly," Miss Marple said softly. "And poor Mr. Thorne was so very active right up to the end. I saw him talking with young Mr. Pendleton near the gatehouse just before the festivities began. They seemed quite absorbed in their conversation." Lady Eleanor's hand tightened around the handle of her basket until her knuckles turned white. "Arthur Pendleton is a very hard-working young man. Gregory was merely reviewing the estate survey maps with him. It was purely professional." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed innocently, noticing how Lady Eleanor lowered her gaze, avoiding direct eye contact. "It reminded me so much of poor Miss Clara Emily, who always became so fiercely defensive whenever anyone mentioned the village apothecary. It turned out, of course, that they were secretly engaged, though her family strongly disapproved." Lady Eleanor stiffened, a sharp intake of breath rustling through her lips. "I assure you, Miss Marple, there are no secrets of that nature here. If you will excuse me, I must attend to the tea service." She turned and hurried away toward the house, her tall, slender frame shivering against the icy wind. Miss Marple watched her go, her keen eyes following the slight, irregular imprint of Lady Eleanor's boots in the fresh dusting of snow. The inspector was quite convinced he had his man locked securely in a cell, but Miss Marple knew better. The trap had been set, but the wrong bird was inside it. Section V. The pocketbook in the snow ***. The afternoon light bled rapidly into a bruised indigo twilight as Miss Marple retraced her steps along the secluded pathway leading to the estate's frozen grotto. Inspector Slack and his men had completed their primary sweeps, leaving only a solitary, miserable constable stationed near the lower gatehouse, his hands thrust deep into his pockets as he stamped his feet to stave off the biting Hampshire cold. Miss Marple moved with quiet purpose, her woolen skirts whispering softly against the snow-dusted gravel. To anyone watching, she appeared to be nothing more than an eccentric elderly woman taking a foolishly brisk evening constitutional. In reality, her eyes were sweeping the terrain with the methodical precision of an expert ornithologist searching for a rare winter migrant. She paused at the base of the grotto, where the massive wall of flint and fieldstone rose toward the iron sluice gate. The blue floodlights had been turned off, leaving the structure in shadow, a jagged, dark silhouette against the pale snow. The air here was noticeably colder, heavy with the sharp, damp smell of wet stone and freezing mud. Miss Marple pulled her fleece shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped off the gravel path, treading carefully onto the soft earth beneath a thick overhang of yew branches. This was the dark, narrow alleyway behind the grotto stone, a place off-limits to the public during the pageant, where the heavy copper pipes and iron intake valves fed water into the artificial pump system. "Now, let me see," Miss Marple whispered softly to herself. "If poor Mr. Thorne was brought here before 9 o'clock, as Inspector Slack insists, why was there no ice frozen upon the lower rock ledge where he fell?" She knelt down with surprising agility for a woman of her years, taking care to keep her woolen hem above the damp soil. She reached into her embroidered work bag and withdrew a small, silver-handled magnifying glass, a gift from her nephew Raymond, and peered closely at the ground behind the primary intake valve. The snow beneath the dense yew branches was thin and patchy, protected from the open sky, but right beside the cast-iron casing of the secondary drainage pump, Miss Marple noticed a small, distinct patch of disturbance. The pine needles and frozen leaves had been scraped aside, revealing dark, saturated soil beneath. She reached out a gloved finger and touched the earth. It was soft, muddy, and warm to the touch. Warm. Miss Marple's eyes brightened with sharp interest. She peered closer at the base of the iron casing. A small brass drainage cock had been turned slightly open, and a slow, steady trickle of lukewarm water was weeping from the pipe into the soil. It was the drainage system for the manor's boiler house, a secondary line designed to flush warm water through the pump mechanics to prevent the external sluice gates from seizing in extreme temperatures. "Dear me," Miss Marple murmured, her mind instantly making the connection. Not a frozen death at 9 o'clock at all. The body was kept here, kept warm by the heat of the boiler runoff, to prevent the natural onset of rigor mortis and freezing until much, much later. She stood up, brushing a fleck of bark from her coat, her gentle face setting into an expression of grim satisfaction. The timeline that Inspector Slack had so confidently constructed was entirely false. Gregory Thorne had not died at 9 o'clock when Julian Vance was seen lurking near the grotto. He had been killed earlier, or perhaps later, and his body hidden in this warm alcove behind the pump until the murderer was ready to drop him into the rising floodwaters. As she stepped back out into the open path, her boot brushed against something hard nestled in the roots of an ancient holly tree. Miss Marple paused, lowering her magnifying glass. She bent down and carefully lifted a small leather-bound notebook, almost completely obscured by fresh snowfall. It was a pocket-sized appointment ledger, its cover embossed with simple gold initials, *GT me. Her fingers trembled slightly with anticipation as she opened the wet leather cover. The pages were stiff with frost, but the dark ink remained legible. She flipped past the standard business appointments, meetings with tenants, bank managers, and parish councils, until she reached the entry for the previous afternoon, December 21st. Scrawled across the page in Thorne's aggressive, heavy hand were 3 brief entries. *4. 0 p.m. AP. Parish boundaries / final notice. *5. 30 p.m. DV. Letters returned / no further extension. *8. 0 p.m. RV. Boiler account clearing / midnight settlement. Miss Marple stared at the second entry. EV. Letters returned. Lady Eleanor Vance. And below it, the entry for Sir Reginald himself. *boiler account clearing. Suddenly, the quiet crunch of heavy boots on frozen gravel echoed from around the bend in the yew hedge. Miss Marple snapped the ledger shut with practiced swiftness and slipped it deep into her spacious embroidered workbag, right beside her ball of lilac wool and knitting needles. A tall figure emerged from the gloom. It was Arthur Pendleton, his coat collar turned up high against his neck, his face pale and shadowed in the twilight. He stopped dead when he saw Miss Marple standing near the grotto. "Miss Marple," Pendleton exclaimed, his voice high and nervous. What are you doing out here in the cold? It isn't safe. The police have closed off this entire area." "Oh, good evening, dear Arthur," Miss Marple replied with a bright, fluttery smile, clutching her workbag close to her chest. "I was merely looking for a dropped stitch from my knitting wool. I am so terribly forgetful these days. It reminds me so much of poor old Miss Weatherby, who spent 3 hours searching for her spectacles when they were resting right upon her forehead all the time." Pendleton's eyes darted frantically toward the roots of the holly tree, then back to Miss Marple's serene, smiling face. "You shouldn't be wandering around in the dark," he said stiffly, his hands clenching into fists inside his pockets. "There are dangerous people about." "Indeed there are, Arthur," Miss Marple said, her voice dropping into a gentle, almost mournful register. "Especially those who feel they have been pushed into a corner from which there is no escape." Section 6. Shadows and Secrets, ***. The evening mist settled over Winterbrook Manor like a damp velvet shroud, muffling the faint tolling of the parish church clock as it struck 7. Inside the manor's drawing room, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. A roaring fire blazed in the marble hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the mahogany furniture, yet a persistent chill seemed to emanate from the very walls. Miss Marple sat in a high-backed armchair near the corner, her fingers steadily working the lilac cardigan. Nearby, Lady Eleanor stood by the French windows, staring out into the blackness of the lawn, her silhouette rigid and fragile. Sir Reginald paced the oriental rug with heavy, agitated strides, while young Arthur Pendleton sat motionless on the edge of a settee, nervously shredding a paper napkin into tiny, jagged fragments. The door clicked open, and Inspector Slack marched into the room, his face flushed with the authority of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Good evening, all," Slack announced, slapping his leather gloves against his thigh. "I've just completed a secondary interview with Mr. Julian Vance down at the station. He's sticking to his story. Claims he went to the grotto at 8:45 to meet Thorne, found no one there and left. A likely tale, given his £5,000 debt." "My brother is many foolish things, Inspector, but he is not a murderer," Sir Reginald said sharply, stopping his pacing to glare at the officer. "You are fixated on a single promissory note while ignoring the wider context of Gregory Thorne's affairs." "The context, Sir Reginald, is that your brother had no money and everything to lose," Slack retorted smoothly. "Unless, of course, someone else in this room had a compelling reason to wish Thorne silenced." Slack's sharp eyes darted toward Arthur Pendleton, who flinched as though struck. "What about you, Mr. Pendleton?" Slack pressed, stepping closer to the young surveyor. "We know Thorne was auditing the parish boundary records. We also know your father's estate management accounts showed significant discrepancies during the land revaluations 10 years ago. Discrepancies that Thorne was on the verge of making public." Arthur's face drained of all color. He leaped to his feet, the torn napkin fluttering to the floor like snow. "My father was an honorable man. Whatever mistakes were made in those ledgers were administrative errors, nothing more. Thorne was twisting those figures to blackmail me, to force me to sign off on false boundary lines for his new development scheme. Arthur, please, Lady Eleanor gasped, stepping forward, her hands clasped tightly over her heart. No, Eleanor, let him hear it, Arthur cried, his voice crackling with suppressed fury and distress. Thorn was a monster. He squeezed everyone in this village until they bled. He held my father's reputation over my head, and he cut himself off abruptly, his eyes darting guiltily towards Sir Reginald. Sir Reginald's eyes narrowed. And he what, Pendleton? What else did he hold over you, or perhaps over my wife? A heavy, suffocating silence fell upon the drawing room. The crackle of the hearth sounded unnaturally loud. Lady Eleanor stood frozen, her eyes wide with terror, looking like a deer caught in the glare of a lantern. Miss Marple gently lowered her knitting into her lap, her clear blue eyes moving with quiet, profound compassion from Lady Eleanor to Arthur Pendleton. It is so very exhausting, isn't it? Miss Marple said softly, her voice cutting through the tension like a gentle breeze. To carry the weight of a secret that was never truly yours to bear in the first place. Inspector Slack frowned, irritated by the interruption. Miss Marple, please, this is a police interrogation. I am merely thinking of poor Lavinia Croft back in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple continued mildly, completely ignoring Slack's protest. She spent 20 years paying off a scoundrel who claimed to have compromising letters written by her late mother. She lived in constant dread, denying herself every happiness, only to discover long after the man had passed away that the letters were complete fabrications, written by the blackmailer himself to exploit her deep sense of loyalty. Lady Eleanor let out a shuddering, breathless gasp and buried her face in her hands. Eleanor? Sir Reginald said, his voice dropping its harsh edge, replaced by a sudden, creeping uncertainty. What is she talking about? He had letters. Reginald? Lady Eleanor sobbed, her shoulders trembling violently. Letters I wrote to Arthur 2 years ago, when things between us were so cold, and I was so dreadfully lonely. There was nothing dishonorable in them, only my unhappiness. But Gregory stole them from my desk. He threatened to show them to you, to ruin Arthur's career and destroy our family, unless I persuaded you to sell him the Eastern timber rights at a fraction of their value. Arthur stepped toward her, his face twisted in agony. I tried to get them back for her, Sir Reginald. I swore I would find a way to pay him off or force him to return them, but I didn't kill him. I swear on my mother's grave I did not strike him. Inspector Slack crossed his arms, looking immensely self-satisfied. So, we have blackmailed wives, desperate lovers, and ruinous debts. A regular hornet's nest. It seems almost everyone had a reason to want Gregory Thorn dead. Yes, Miss Marple agreed softly, picking up her needles once more. Asterisk, click-clack, click-clack. Almost everyone had a motive, Inspector. But a motive is merely a feeling, whereas a murder requires opportunity, precise timing, and above all, a very specific physical capability. She looked directly at Sir Reginald, whose hands were resting heavily on the dark marble mantelpiece, his fingers twitching rhythmically against the cool stone. Tell me, Sir Reginald, Miss Marple asked innocently. When you turned the heavy iron valve at 11 o'clock last night, you used both hands and stepped forward with your left foot, did you not? Just as you always do when operating the estate's heavy machinery. Sir Reginald stiffened, staring at her in utter bewilderment. I suppose so. What on earth has that to do with anything? Oh, nothing at all, dear Sir Reginald, Miss Marple replied with a sweet, vague smile. Just a small detail about human habit. We are all such creatures of habit, aren't we? Section 7. The second shiver asterisk. The wind howled through the chimneys of Winterbrook Manor as night fully descended, driving a fresh flurry of powdery snow against the tall leaded windows. Inside the drawing room, the revelation of Gregory Thorn's predatory blackmail had shattered the fragile veneer of polite society, leaving behind a raw, trembling silence. Inspector Slack, thoroughly enjoying his position at the center of the drama, checked his pocket watch with an exaggerated air of authority. Well, this certainly broadens our horizons, he announced briskly. A whole nest of motives. Lady Eleanor blackmailed, Mr. Pendleton desperate to cover his family's honor, and Mr. Julian facing immediate financial ruin. It's a remarkable piece of work. It is a web of absolute misery, Sir Reginald corrected, his voice raspy with a mixture of anger and humiliation. He stood near the hearth, avoiding his wife's teardrop-stained eyes, his face drawn and pale. The man was a bloodsucker, feeding on the private misfortunes of his neighbors. "Be that as it may, Sir Reginald, murder remains murder," Slack said sternly. "And while I still hold Mr. Julian in primary custody, I shall require full statements from both Lady Eleanor and Mr. Pendleton regarding their movements between 8 and 10 o'clock yesterday evening." Miss Marple quietly adjusted her lilac cardigan, her bright eyes following Constable Wiggins as he entered the room, looking thoroughly chilled and carrying a small oilcloth-wrapped bundle. "Excuse me, Inspector," Wiggins piped up, wiping his wet nose with the back of his sleeve. "The search team just finished clearing the lower ice house near the old mill pond. We found this tucked behind the salt barrels." Slack stepped forward, eagerly unwrapping the damp cloth. Inside lay a heavy iron wrench, its surface pitted with rust and stained with dark, dried brownish smears. Beside it sat a heavy leather pouch containing a thick stack of banknotes and several folded parchment documents. Slack exclaimed, his eyes glittering with triumph. "The murder weapon, and Thorne's missing personal wallet, untouched. This disproves any theory of a random mugging by a tramp. The killer hit him, hid the weapon, and tried to make it look like a robbery, but panicked and dumped the spoils in the icehouse. Or perhaps," Miss Marple ventured softly, her needles continuing their gentle cadence, "the person who placed those items there wanted them to be found in precisely that location." Slack rounded on her, his patience visibly wearing thin. "Miss Marple, with all due respect, the evidence speaks for itself. The ice house sits directly along the path leading from the grotto to the south wing of the manor, the very wing where Mr. Julian Vance was staying, and where Mr. Pendleton keeps his surveying equipment. It is also directly beside the path used by the boiler house stokers, Inspector," Miss Marple remarked mildly. "A path that is kept clear of snow all winter long to allow the heavy coal carts to pass. Anyone walking along it would leave no footprints whatsoever in the ice." Before Slack could formulate a sharp retort, the heavy double doors of the drawing room burst open. Clara Higgins rushed in, her bonnet askew, clutching her wool coat tightly around her trembling frame. "Oh, Inspector, Sir Reginald," Clara gasped, her breath coming in ragged, terrified hitches. "You must come quickly. Something terrible has happened at the estate office." "Oh, more. What is it now, Mrs. Higgins?" Slack demanded, scowling at the interruption. "It's Mr. Julian's clerk, young Thomas," Clara squeaked, pointing a trembling gloved finger back toward the corridor. "He went back to the office to collect Mr. Julian's private ledgers on the vicar's advice. Someone ambushed him in the dark. He was struck down from behind." A sharp collective gasp echoed through the room. Arthur Pendleton took a step back, his face turning paper white, while Sir Reginald gripped the edge of the mantelpiece so hard his knuckles turned grey. Slack cursed under his breath and motioned for Wiggins to follow him. "Nobody leaves this room. Wiggins, lock the terrace doors." The two officers dashed out into the hallway, their heavy boots echoing down the polished parquet floor. Miss Marple did not join the sudden commotion. She sat remarkably still, her eyes fixed on the small leather pouch Slack had left sitting open on the side table. The folded parchment documents were partially visible beneath the damp oilcloth, while the room remained in chaos. Sir Reginald rushing to comfort the weeping Lady Eleanor, and Mrs. Higgins babbling hysterically to Arthur. Miss Marple rose with quiet, unobtrusive grace. She glided across the carpet to the side table, her fleecy shawl draped over her arm. With a movement so swift and practiced it would have done credit to a professional pickpocket, she lifted the top document just far enough to read the bold copperplate header beneath the dark stains. It was not a boundary survey, nor was it a love letter. It was an official permit for the high-pressure conversion of the manor's central heating boilers, signed 3 months prior by the county building inspector and countersigned by Gregory Thorne in his capacity as legal notary. Attached to it was a private bank receipt detailing a monthly transfer of £200 to a discreet account in London. Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes widened slightly. The missing piece of the mosaic slid into place with the quiet, definitive click of a well-oiled lock. A second attack, she whispered to herself, her heart aching for the innocent people caught in this web of deception. Not to cover up a crime of passion or a stolen romance, but to prevent the truth about the ice itself from ever coming to light. She returned to her armchair just as Inspector Slack returned, looking thoroughly rattled. "The boy is alive," Slack reported gruffly, though his confident posture had noticeably sagged. "Suffering from a nasty concussion, but he'll recover. He says he caught someone searching Thorne's private strongbox. The intruder struck him with a brass candlestick and fled through the window." "Then my brother couldn't have done it," Sir Reginald declared, stepping forward, a flicker of hope returning to his eyes. "Julian is locked in a cell at the police station." "Or he had an accomplice," Slack insisted stubbornly, though his voice lacked its previous conviction. "Someone who needed those ledgers destroyed before we could examine them." Miss Marple looked up from her work, her face serene, gentle, and utterly relentless. "Or perhaps, Inspector, the killer realized that they had left behind the one piece of evidence that could prove beyond a shadow of a doubt how Mr. Thorne actually died. How Mr. Thorne actually died." Section 8. The trap is set ****. The storm outside mounted in fury, driving thick sheets of snow against the leaded panes, but inside the manor's morning room, a different kind of frost had settled. The household had gathered at Miss Marple's quiet, polite insistence, conveyed through the vicar with an air of urgent neighborly concern. Even Inspector Slack had agreed to attend, convinced that the elderly spinster was finally about to offer a formal confession on behalf of one of her village favorites. The room was dimly lit, saved from darkness only by the glowing embers of the hearth and a pair of brass floor lamps. Miss Marple sat in her customary high-backed chair, a small table beside her bearing a silver tray, a carafe of water, and 3 distinct glass vials filled with clear, colorless liquids. Her ball of lilac wool rested in her lap, the knitting needles sitting idle across her knees. Sir Reginald stood near the fireplace, his heavy jaw set in a hard, defensive line. Beside him, Lady Eleanor sat stiffly, her face pale and drawn, her fingers tightly interlaced. Arthur Pendleton leaned against the mahogany bookcase, his eyes darting anxiously between the elderly woman and Inspector Slack, who stood with his arms folded near the door, his expression one of weary condescension. "Now then, Miss Marple," Slack began, clicking his pocket watch open and shut with a sharp metal snap. "You said you had a matter of vital importance to demonstrate regarding the late Mr. Thorne's death, and that it concerned the attack on young Thomas in the office. I hope this isn't another sermon about village gossip." "Oh no, Inspector," Miss Marple replied with a sweet, disarming smile. "I am the first to admit that village gossip is often terribly untidy. But human nature, you see, is remarkably predictable. When a person is frightened, they act precisely as their character dictates. Just like poor old Mr. Hargreaves back in St. Mary Mead, who was so terrified of being exposed for taking extra coal from the church cellar that he buried his shovel in the rector's rose garden, thereby pointing the finger of suspicion directly at himself." Sir Reginald shifted uncomfortably, kicking a stray ember back into the hearth. "If you have something constructiveness to say, Jane, please say it. My family has been dragged through enough mud today." "Indeed you have, Sir Reginald," Miss Marple said softly, her blue eyes brimming with genuine sympathy. "And it is most unfair. You see, Inspector Slack has been laboring under a most unfortunate misapprehension, created entirely by the clever design of the murderer. He believes Gregory Thorne died at 9 o'clock, shortly before the ceremonial lighting of the grotto." "He did die then," Slack insisted, stepping forward. "Julian Vance was seen near the grotto at 8:45, and Thorne's body was jammed in the sluice gate when the valve was opened at 11. "He was jammed in the gate at 11, certainly," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "But he did not die at 9. Nor was he killed by your client's hands, Sir Reginald, nor by young Mr. Pendleton's." Arthur let out a long, shuddering breath, while Lady Eleanor turned to stare at Miss Marple in stunned surprise. "The physical evidence, Inspector, tells a very different story," Miss Marple continued, reaching out to touch one of the glass vials on the silver tray. "You noted that Mr. Thorne's clothes were wet when he was pulled from the ice. You assumed the heat of the floodlights had melted the snow. But I took the liberty of examining the small drainage line behind the grotto's intake pump this afternoon." Slack frowned, his eyebrows knitting together. "The drainage line, the secondary runoff from the manor's central heating boilers. Miss Marple explained. A system designed to flush warm water through the iron mechanics to prevent them from freezing in extreme weather. Mr. Thorne's body was placed in that warm, hidden alcove immediately after he was struck down, which occurred not at 9 o'clock, but much earlier, shortly after 5 o'clock in the afternoon. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the room. 5 o'clock? Slack scoffed, though his voice lacked conviction. Nonsense. Thorne was seen talking to people throughout the evening. Was he? Miss Marple asked softly. Or did people merely see a tall man in an expensive tweed coat and a soft felt hat walking through the dim twilight, seen from a distance while the brass band played and the snow fell thick? A coat and hat that were easily retrieved from the cloakroom and returned after the body was moved? She turned her gaze slowly toward the hearth, her voice dropping into a quiet, persuasive rhythm. The murderer needed time, you see. Time to establish an alibi. Time to manipulate poor Mr. Julian's debt. And above all, time to ensure that the body would freeze rapidly the moment it was transferred into the main sluice gate at 10 o'clock, just before the public countdown. Sir Reginald took a sharp step back, his face darkening. This is outrageous speculation. What possible motive could account for such an elaborate, absurd charade? Not an absurd charade, Sir Reginald, Miss Marple said gently, lifting the second glass vial into the lamplight. A very cold, calculated matter of business. You see, Gregory Thorne was not just a blackmailer of personal secrets. He was an auditor, and 3 weeks ago he discovered that the heavy financial losses attributed to the manor's boiler conversion were not losses at all. The funds had been systematically siphoned into a private account in Switzerland. Sir Reginald's mouth opened, but no sound came out, and when young Thomas went to the office tonight, Miss Marple added, her voice ringing clear and true through the silent room, he was not searching for Mr. Julian's promissory notes. He was looking for the duplicate boiler inspection receipts, the very receipts that prove the fraud was initiated not by the contractors, but by the estate's sole trustee. Miss Marple paused, her calm, searching gaze settling directly upon Sir Reginald Vance. She did not raise her voice. She simply sat, frail and serene, watching the heavy, muscular man drop his eyes, his hands trembling violently against his sides. The trap had sprung, and the silence in the room was absolute. Section 9. The cold truth ***. The silence hanging in the morning room was no longer the heavy hush of winter, but the suffocating stillness that follows a dropped executioner's axe. Sir Reginald Vance stood anchored to the hearth-rug, his face a mottled grayish-white. His large hands, usually so prone to dramatic, authoritative gestures, hung dead at his sides. Inspector Slack looked between the frail elderly woman sitting calmly with her lilac knitting and the towering baronet. Sir Reginald. Slack's voice had lost its bluster, replaced by a sudden, sharp, professional tension. What is she talking about? It is all quite straightforward, Inspector, Miss Marple said softly, picking up her ball of wool and adjusting a loose strand. When a man has lived far beyond his means for many years, maintaining a grand estate, building extravagant winter grottos, and hosting lavish pageants for the county, the money must come from somewhere. Sir Reginald had exhausted his inheritance, mortgaged the tenant farms, and squeezed every penny from his brother's estate. But there was one untapped reservoir left. The trust fund, Lady Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking as she stared at her husband in horror. My father's legacy for the estate's permanent upkeep. Precisely, Lady Eleanor. Miss Marple nodded compassionately. A trust that required dual authorization for any major capital expenditure. Sir Reginald managed to divert £30,000 under the guise of an extensive high-pressure boiler and drainage conversion for the manor grounds. It was a phantom project. Cheap, substandard pipes were installed, while the vast bulk of the funds was transferred directly overseas. You have no proof of this madness, Sir Reginald boomed, though the thunder in his voice sounded hollow, like a theatrical prop. Thorne was my solicitor. He handled my legal affairs. He did indeed, Miss Marple replied mildly. And because he was a meticulous, deeply grasping man, he kept duplicate records of every transaction. When Gregory Thorne conducted his annual end-of-year audit 3 days ago, he discovered the embezzlement. But Mr. Thorne was not an honorable man who went straight to the police. He saw an opportunity for the ultimate leverage. Miss Marple turned her clear blue eyes toward Arthur Pendleton. He used his knowledge to squeeze everyone. He threatened young Arthur with his father's old land records to force compliance on new deeds. He used old, innocent letters to terrorize poor Lady Eleanor into signing away her timber rights. And he demanded that Sir Reginald sign over the entire southern acreage of the estate to him by midnight on the solstice, or face immediate criminal prosecution for fraud. He was going to ruin me, Sir Reginald spat suddenly, the dam breaking as a rush of bitter, venomous rage spilled from his lips. He glared at the floor, his shoulders heaving. A little, petty village clerk, dictating terms to a Vance of Winterbrook. He stood in my study at 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon and laughed in my face. He told me I would be stripping my own crest from the gates by New Year's Day. Lady Eleanor pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, stifling a quiet sob. Arthur Pendleton stepped instinctively closer to her, his hand resting supportively near her shoulder, his earlier fear completely replaced by pity and shock. And so, Miss Marple continued, her tone mournful rather than accusatory, you struck him down. It was not a planned, cold-blooded ambush at 9 o'clock, as the inspector believed. It was an explosion of desperate rage in the boiler house workshop at 5:15. You hit him with a heavy iron wrench from the maintenance bench. I didn't intend to kill him, Sir Reginald snarled, his eyes wild as he stepped forward, pointing a shaking finger at Miss Marple. He fell against the iron piping, but once he was dead, once he was lying there on the floor, I realized I had a chance. The pageant was starting. Hundreds of people were arriving on the lawn. And you knew the mechanics of your own estate better than anyone, Miss Marple said. You dragged his body into the warm alcove behind the secondary drainage line. The warm runoff from the active boilers kept his body temperature elevated, preventing the natural onset of rigor mortis and freezing that would have betrayed the true time of death to a medical examiner. Inspector Slack took a step toward Sir Reginald, his hand resting on his leather truncheon pouch. And the tweed coat? Sir Reginald simply put on Thorne's coat and hat, Miss Marple explained gently. He walked out into the dim, snowy twilight at 8:45, allowing himself to be seen near the grotto by several villagers, and by his poor brother Julian, who had come searching for Thorne to beg for an extension on his loan. Sir Reginald stepped behind the yew hedge, shed the coat, and returned Thorne's body to the upper grotto stage. Then, at 11 o'clock, with grand dramatic flair, he turned the main iron valve himself, letting the rushing floodwaters carry the body into the iron sluice gate, framed in blue floodlights for the entire village to witness. Sir Reginald stood trembling, the full weight of his horrific gamble crashing down upon him. It was perfect, he whispered, staring blindly at the silver tray on the side table. It would have been blamed on Julian, or a robbery, or a tragic accident in the dark. How could you possibly know about the boiler runoff? How could an old woman know? Miss Marple looked up from her work, her expression filled with a quiet, profound sadness. Because, Sir Reginald, human nature is so terribly constant. Years ago, in St. Mary Mead, old Mr. Pringle tried to hide the true time his prize swine had died, to claim the insurance money by keeping it beside his greenhouse furnace. It is always the same. People in a desperate corner always turn to the small, clever tricks they think no one else will notice. Inspector Slack stepped forward, his face grim. Sir Reginald Vance, I am arresting you for the murder of Gregory Thorne. You are not obliged to say anything. As Slack read the formal caution, Sir Reginald offered no resistance. He allowed himself to be led away into the dark, snowy night. Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair, her knitting needles picking up their gentle, rhythmic movement once more. Asterisk, click, clack, click, clack. The terrible storm outside was finally beginning to clear. Section X. The quiet spring, asterisk, asterisk. By the following afternoon, the fierce Hampshire blizzard had finally spent its fury, leaving the village of Winterbrook wrapped in a blanket of dazzling, pristine snow. The sky above was a pale, clear winter blue, and the icy silence that had gripped the manor grounds for 2 long days began to give way to the ordinary, comforting sounds of daily life. Smoke curled lazily from the red brick chimneys, and the sharp, cheerful ring of a blacksmith's hammer echoed down the high street. Inside the cozy, firelit parlor of the vicarage, the atmosphere was one of profound relief mingled with a quiet, lingering sadness. The vicar sat in his armchair beside the hearth, blowing softly on a cup of black coffee, while Mrs. Higgins bustled about the tea table, arranging a fresh plate of hot buttered scones. Miss Marple sat in her familiar place by the leaded bay window, her fleecy shawl wrapped snugly around her shoulders. The light blue cardigan she had been working on throughout the ordeal was now complete, its neat wooden buttons fastened to the hem, resting neatly in her wicker work basket. "It is still so difficult to comprehend," Mrs. Higgins said, shaking her head as she poured dark tea into fine china cups. Sir Reginald, a man who chaired the parish council, who gave so generously to the church restoration fund, to think he was capable of such cold, calculated deceit. "The human heart, Clara dear, is a very dark and complicated place when vanity and financial desperation take root," Miss Marple replied mildly, picking up a small silver spoon to stir her tea. Sir Reginald was not inherently a monster, I suppose. He was simply a man who could not bear the thought of losing his position in the world. He preferred to commit a terrible crime rather than face the humiliation of being seen as a failure by his neighbors. "And poor Lady Eleanor," the vicar remarked, his voice filled with deep pastoral sympathy, to learn that her husband had not only ruined the estate's trust, but was using her own private, innocent confidences as a pawn in his dreadful game with Thorn. "She is remarkably resilient," Miss Marple noted softly, looking out through the window toward the snow-dusted lane. "I saw her walking toward the lower garden earlier with young Mr. Pendleton. Arthur is a good young man, so very like his late father in his sense of duty. He will help her sort through the estate's tangled affairs, I am sure. And with Inspector Slack satisfied, young Mr. Julian has been released from custody, thoroughly chastened by his narrow escape from the gallows. I hear Julian has pledged to sell his motor car to pay off his local debts," Mrs. Higgins added, dropping 2 lumps of sugar into her cup. "A most promising sign of reformation, though one must wait and see." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Reformation often begins with a severe fright, Clara. It reminds me so much of young Fred Thompson back in St. Mary Mead. He was a most reckless boy who was always poaching the squire's pheasants and running up tab debts at the tavern. But after he was wrongfully accused of stealing the church collection plate and narrowly avoided prison, he turned over an entirely new leaf and became a most respectable railway clerk in Portsmouth." The vicar chuckled softly. "You always find a parallel in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple." "Because people are so very much the same everywhere, Vicar," Miss Marple said simply, her clear blue eyes twinkling with gentle wisdom. "Whether they live in a grand manor house or a humble thatched cottage, their fundamental desires for respect, for love, for security are precisely identical. And when those desires are threatened by exposure or ruin, human nature reveals itself in the most predictable ways." She paused, looking out toward the distant silhouette of the manor's frozen grotto. The elaborate blue floodlights had been removed, and the artificial pump system lay silent and broken beneath a thick cap of soft white snow. The natural spring that fed the stream had reclaimed its original quiet path, trickling gently over the dark flint stones without theatrical display or violent force. "It is a mercy," Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself, "that the truth has a way of coming to the surface, no matter how deeply one tries to bury it beneath ice and stone." "Ah, and Inspector Slack?" Mrs. Higgins asked with a mischievous glint in her eye. "I suppose he took full credit for the arrest when he reported to the chief constable this morning?" "Oh, naturally," Miss Marple replied with a light musical chuckle. "He informed the local press that the solution was the result of rigorous police procedure and meticulous logical analysis regarding the boiler mechanics. He was kind enough to remark that my presence at the manor had been a pleasant distraction for the ladies." "The arrogant fool," Mrs. Higgins huffed, setting her teacup down with a sharp clatter. "He wouldn't have known warm boiler runoff from a frozen pond if you hadn't pointed his nose right at it." Now, Clara," Miss Marple chided gently, taking a delicate bite of her buttered scone. "It is far better that way. Officers of the law must maintain their authority in the public eye. It gives the village a sense of security. An old woman's idle observations about human habits and boiler pipes are far better kept within the quiet confines of a drawing room." She turned her gaze back to the window, In the lane below, a small robin perched upon the icy fence post, fluffing its bright red feathers against the crisp air before bursting into a sweet, vibrant song. The dark shadow that had fallen over Winterbrook was lifting at last. The secrets had been laid bare, the guilty held accountable, and the innocent allowed to heal. Miss Marple closed her wicker work basket with a satisfying click, her hands resting quietly in her lap, her serene, elderly face radiating that gentle, unyielding composure that saw so clearly into the depths of the human soul. Fear. Section 11. Epilogue at the tea table, asterisk. 3 days after Sir Reginald's confession had sent shockwaves through the county, the mid-afternoon sun had restored a cheerful, shimmering brightness to the thatched cottages of Winterbrook. The heavy snow had begun a gradual, slushy retreat along the high street, revealing the dark cobblestones beneath, and filling the roadside gutters with a steady, musical gurgle of melting ice. In the cozy, chintz-draped parlour of the vicarage, Miss Marple sat in her favoured armchair, her wool work-bag resting beside her footstool. Across the low tea table sat Raymond West, her novelist nephew, who had hurried down from London the moment the news of the tragedy reached the metropolis. He sat with one long leg crossed over the other, sipping a cup of Earl Grey, looking at his aunt with a mixture of fond amusement and lingering bewilderment. "It is extraordinary, Aunt Jane," Raymond remarked, setting his cup down upon its saucer with a delicate chink. "I come down expecting to find a quiet country village slumbering under a winter blanket, and instead I find you at the very heart of a melodrama involving embezzlement, theatrical grottos, and a murder staged within a block of ice. It reads like the plot of a rather sensational French novel." Miss Marple smiled gently, her blue eyes twinkling over the rim of her spectacles as she adjusted her lace cap. "Life, my dear Raymond, is so very rarely like a French novel. French novels are so full of elaborate, passionate motives and highly dramatic gestures. Real life, particularly in an English village, is usually driven by much simpler, poorer impulses. Vanity, fear of what the neighbors will say, and the terrible desire to keep up appearances when the money has run out. Yet you must admit," Raymond pressed, leaning forward, "the murderer's scheme was remarkably ingenious. Utilizing the boiler system's warm runoff to delay the onset of rigor mortis and disguise the true time of death, it shows a positive genius for mechanical trickery." "Not genius, Raymond," Miss Marple corrected mildly, her hand reaching into her bag for a fresh skein of soft grey wool. "Simply familiarity. Sir Reginald knew his own estate. He knew how the pipes functioned because he had spent 3 months obsessing over the cost of their installation. People always turn to the things they know best when they are desperate. It reminds me so much of old Mr. Baines, the village carpenter back home. When he attempted to hide the parish church's stolen silver communion cup, he didn't construct a secret panel or dig a hole in the woods. He simply built it directly into the frame of the new pulpit, using his ordinary mortise joints. He assumed no one would look closely at plain, familiar woodwork. "And Inspector Slack?" Raymond asked with a dry chuckle. "I understand he was less than thrilled by your informal assistance." "Oh, Inspector Slack is a very energetic man," Miss Marple replied generously. "He works exceedingly hard with his notebooks and his measuring tapes. It is just that he focuses so entirely on the things, the muddy footprints, the broken watches, the signed promissory notes, that he quite forgets to look at the asterisk people asterisk. A footprint merely tells you that someone walked across a lawn. It tells you nothing about why they were walking, or whether they were terrified, or angry, or simply looking for a lost glove." "And Lady Eleanor?" Raymond asked softly, his tone turning sympathetic. "What will become of her and the estate?" "She will manage quite well, I think," Miss Marple said, her voice filled with quiet confidence. "The court will oversee the liquidation of Sir Reginald's private assets to settle the trust's debts. Lady Eleanor has her own small jointure, which was thankfully beyond her husband's reach. She intends to remain at the manor for the time being, living simply in the West Wing, and young Arthur Pendleton has been retained as the permanent land manager. A most suitable arrangement." "Suitable indeed," Raymond agreed with a knowing smile. "From what the vicar tells me, young Pendleton has been remarkably devoted to her throughout this entire ordeal." Miss Marple looked up from her wool, her expression serene and gently reproving. "They are both very sensible people, Raymond. They have suffered a great deal from the malice of others, and they understand the value of patience. In a year or two, when the village has forgotten the worst of the scandal, I expect we shall hear of a very quiet wedding at the parish church. Human nature, you see, has a wonderful capacity for healing once the poisonous element has been removed. The parlor door opened, and Clara Higgins entered, carrying a freshly baked batch of almond biscuits on a silver platter. "Oh, Raymond, you must try one of these while they are warm. Jane, the postman just dropped off the afternoon mail. There is a letter for you from St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple accepted the small envelope, recognizing the neat, round handwriting of her friend Miss Weatherby. She broke the wax seal and scanned the contents with a mild, affectionate smile. "Is everything well at home, Aunt Jane?" Raymond asked. "Oh, quite well, my dear," Miss Marple replied, folding the letter carefully and slipping it into her pocket. "Though it seems poor Mrs. Gable's prize-laying hen has gone missing, and the parish council is in a great state of turmoil over who should pay for the repairs to the church organ. They seem to suspect the new curate, simply because he plays the flute." She picked up her knitting needles once more, their familiar rhythm resuming. Asterisk, click-clack, click-clack, I think, Miss Marple added softly, looking out at the golden winter sunlight resting on the garden hedge. "It is high time I returned home. St. Mary Mead can be so very troublesome when there is no one there to remind people how predictable human nature truly is." Section 12. The Journey Home. Asterisk, asterisk. The morning mist was just beginning to lift off the platforms at Winterbrook Station when the steam train pulled in with a gentle wheezing hiss. White plumes of vapor rose into the crisp morning air, blending with the frosty breath of the few passengers gathered beside the luggage carts. Miss Marple stood on the stone platform, neatly dressed in her heavy tweed traveling coat and a dark velvet toque hat. Raymond West hovered attentively beside her, holding her small leather suitcase and a neatly rolled woolen rug, while Mrs. Higgins fussed over a small wicker basket filled with sandwiches and a flask of hot tea for the journey. "Now, Jane dear, you are quite sure you have everything?" Clara Higgins asked for the third time, adjusting the ribbon on Miss Marple's collar. "The carriage journey from the junction at Much Benham can be terribly draughty, and the wind is coming straight off the hills today." "I am abundantly provided for, Clara dear," Miss Marple replied with a serene, radiant smile. "Your lovely buttered scones and this beautiful rug will make the trip positively luxurious. You have been the kindest of hostesses during a most trying week." "It is we who must thank you, Aunt Jane," Raymond said warmly, handing the suitcase to the uniformed porter who had stepped forward to collect their luggage. "The entire parish owes you an enormous debt. If you had not observed those subtle physical anomalies behind the grotto, an innocent man would be facing the gallows today, and a very dangerous criminal would still be walking free." "Oh, nonsense, Raymond," Miss Marple said with a dismissive wave of her gloved hand. "Inspector Slack is a very capable officer. He would have arrived at the correct conclusion eventually, once he had finished weighing all his tape measurements and counting his boot prints. I merely saved him a small amount of unnecessary legwork." Raymond smiled knowingly at Mrs. Higgins, who smothered a quiet laugh behind her woolen scarf. A sharp whistle echoed down the track, and the guard called out the final boarding warning for the local stopping train to Salisbury and the West. Raymond assisted his aunt up the high iron steps into a tidy, second-class compartment upholstered in dark navy plush. He placed her rug across her knees and arranged her wicker work bag on the seat beside her. "I have telegraphed your housekeeper, Cherub," Raymond said, leaning through the open carriage window. "She will have a fire lit in the sitting room and the kettle boiling by the time your fly arrives from the station at St. Mary Mead." "You are always so thoughtful, Raymond," Miss Marple said affectionately. "Do give my fondest regards to dear Joan when you return to London tomorrow." Aye, the train gave a sudden, gentle jerk as the heavy iron couplings tightened along the line. Steam billowed past the window, obscuring the platform for a fleeting moment before the red brick station building began to slide slowly away. Miss Marple leaned out, waving her handkerchief until the waving figures of Raymond and Mrs. Higgins shrank into tiny specks in the distance, swallowed up by the rolling Hampshire countryside. Settling back into her corner seat, Miss Marple rested her hands upon her lap. The compartment was warm, heated by the under-seat steam pipes that hummed with a quiet, reassuring thrum. Outside, the landscape drifted past like a peaceful watercolor painting, frost-dusted meadows, dark copses of oak trees, and quiet farmhouses with smoke curling lazily from their stone chimneys. It was difficult to believe that only 3 days ago, this same quiet countryside had been the backdrop for a cold, calculated murder. Yet Miss Marple felt no lingering terror or distress. To her, evil was not a grand, mysterious force from an alien world. It was simply a tragic disease of the human heart, born of unchecked pride, greed, and the foolish illusion that one could escape the consequences of one's actions. She reached into her work bag and withdrew her current knitting project, a tiny pair of white woolen booties intended for the baker's new baby back in the village. Her fingers found the needles, and within seconds the soft, rhythmic clicking echoed comfortably through the train carriage. Asterisk, click-clack, click-clack. She thought briefly of Lady Eleanor, sitting quietly in the sunlit morning room of Winterbrook Manor, beginning the long, painful process of rebuilding her life amidst the ruins of her husband's deceit. She thought of young Arthur Pendleton, whose loyalty and quiet courage had saved the woman he loved from complete despair. And she thought of Sir Reginald, sitting in a stark cell in the County Gael, finally forced to face the unvarnished reality of his own ruin. So many unnecessary tragedies, Miss Marple murmured softly to the empty compartment. If only people would learn to be satisfied with who they truly are, instead of trying to play such grand, foolish parts upon a stage. The train rounded a gentle curve, its whistle sounding a long, cheerful note as it approached the junction signal. The sun broke fully through the winter clouds, bathing the compartment in a warm golden light that glittered against the frost-penciled glass. Miss Marple dropped a stitch, picked it up with practiced, effortless skill, and continued her work. The mystery of the frozen waterfall was solved. The truth had prevailed. And home, with its familiar garden paths, its tea parties, and its quiet, predictable village secrets, was only 2 short train rides away.